Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is my co-host, Janelle Blue, who is president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, who is our co-sponsor. And our guest today is Paul McFarland. Paul is the SIG coordinator, or the Special Interest Group coordinator for the Irish SIG for the Fairfax Genealogical Society. So we're going to be talking about one of the problems that I have, Irish research. And, you know, as an example, I have a grandmother who said that both her parents were Irish. I have now determined that her father was not Irish, he was German, but her mother was Irish. She was Catholic. She, I think, is where my grandmother learned to lie about everything, because I can't find much about her other than in censuses. So we want to talk with Paul about where do we begin?
Well, like all genealogies, begin at the beginning, begin with ourselves. We need to know who our parents were, and the best part about trying to do Irish genealogy is they kept lots of records amongst themselves, even if they were mass cards for funeral masses, clippings, old letters that you need to go through, and you need to insist to yourself upon reaching out to their siblings. As you know, sometimes you find somebody's residence or somebody's home by finding out where their brothers lived or where their brothers' brothers lived, etc. You know, it has to begin. So you must begin here in the United States, and the reason for that is more records exist here in the United States than exist in Ireland. Almost everything they have has been copied or reproduced here in the United States. And trying to go to Ireland and research this is impossible because of the numbers of names that are exactly the same. And I'm reminded of David Rencher. He gave a presentation at one of the genealogy conferences. He's trying to find his wife's ancestors. And there was something like 3,200 people by that name, or close to that name, or close to the first name of Mary or Maria, and it's the old, where do I begin? I can't narrow that down. Mm-hmm. Ireland's naming conventions are in probably only about 2,500 family names. So you're talking about them repeating over and over and over. And so you need to begin right here in the United States. It's very essential that you do that. And the Irish genealogists that I've spoken with said, you've got more records here than we have, and they're more easily accessible than they are in Ireland. And you just can't do it.
For the most part, are they in the Family History Library in Salt Lake, or is there another collection?
Many of them are in Family History Center. Probably here in the Washington, D.C. area, the repository with the largest Irish collection is the Family History Library in McLean.
Huh.
I would say that they have the biggest collection of Irish resources east of the Mississippi, outside of Salt Lake City. It's phenomenal. Yeah. Many are now becoming online in Ireland. Family Search has a lot of good records to look up. You can look things up there. But you need to know who is the person I'm looking for, because you'll find Chuck Mason 13 times and you'll say, I don't know which one of my Chuck Masons is mine. So. Yeah.
But going back to what you're saying, that if you start at your generation and go forward, then you're going to have clues of where they were in the U.S., and then that can help you look for instance, either the genealogical information in that town, or even going online, you can see histories that will name people. So.
And finding them in the census is critical here in the United States, because the later census, as you know, identifies whether they were aliens, registered aliens, or whether they had become naturalized, where they were from, and even though it says Ireland, it does tell you Ireland, although they may sometimes forget, so I always try to find the earliest census because they had a better memory the younger they were, the older they became. It was more difficult to remember those things.
Well, as long as they answered those
As long as they
questions
answered
truthfully. I have somewhere, you know, it's a different year in every census.
That's correct.
That they
Yeah.
came.
My grandfather and his brother, they were born 7 years apart, and by the time 1920 census came around, they were the same age. So,
Well, we all know that it wasn't necessarily that person who was giving
Right.
that information
that's
too.
correct. Yeah.
So, you know, one of the problems you kind of touched on is with names. And, you know, I had always heard that the difference between MacMC and MacMac was whether you were Irish or whether you were Scottish.
No, it's a good story, and there's probably some truth to it. In the 1800s, the Irish, through their Anglicization process, got rid of the O's and the mix from the name. So they were O'Brien, then they became Brian. And then there was a revival of Gaelic culture in the late 1800s. Even the Irish language became popular again. And when they did that, the O's and the mix came back together. Okay. So the Bryans became O'Briens and the Rileys became O'Reillys. Some of them didn't become O's, some of them did. Some of them kept the MC. Supposedly the MC meant son of. Okay. MAC meant grandson of. It probably still does, but that's old tradition that is pretty well gone. There's a couple of slides I'd like to bring up if it's possible.
Sure.
Just to get if we can get that first slide of the map of Ireland, that explains one of the difficulties we have.
There it is.
You can see that there's 32 counties there, and most of us say we know they were from county someplace or other, County Derry or County Armagh or County Galway. But trying to find out where they were from in those counties is a difficult one. And Ireland, if we go to the next slide, we can see that those counties are spread all over. As it's basically a small country. It's an island, which is one of the things that we have to remember. And part of that Mac and Mick is who is Irish and who isn't Irish. Anybody who comes from the island of Ireland is Irish. They may have some other ethnic background as well. Ireland had Norman invasions back in the 700s, and they are Norman Ireland. And there's a good example of it. We had 32 counties, but after the Republic of Ireland was formed in 1922, only 26 counties stayed in the Republic. I mean, only 6 stayed in Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. And that's in the news a lot today because of this Brexit issue, and are they going to tear the borders down, put them back up, or they tore them down, now are they going to put them back up? So it's very important that we know where you come from in those places.
Well, and it's interesting, you know, when you talk about 32 counties, Ireland is, as we saw on the slide, is about the size of South Carolina.
Right.
So it's a relatively small place that you're dealing with. It's not a huge one.
But it's the administrative divisions within Ireland, and there's a slide on that, I think, that shows the problems we have with administrative divisions. If we could just put that up for a second. That shows the one beyond that one, I think.
There it is.
There are the administrative divisions, and as we can see, this is how record keeping is maintained in each one of those, particularly civil parish, registration districts, poor law unions, townlands, all maintain their records. And if you're looking for them, you could be looking in a county, and if you don't know the townland, you will never find that record. or you could be looking for a census record in the county, but if you don't know the registration district, you're spinning your wheels looking for them, and that's what makes it so difficult.
So was there a time when it was required to have a civil registration of a birth or death?
There was, fortunately. Otherwise, we would never find anybody. In 1845, the government of England, the United Kingdom, mandated civil registration marriages of the Church of Ireland. Church of Ireland only. Church of Ireland was the church recognized of Ireland. So they mandated that they do the Church of Ireland records. It worked well, but we still were missing 90% of the population. So in 1864, they mandated all births and marriages in Ireland, regardless of religion, be recorded. And that's what are the records that are available today that you can find for civil records. And they are easily available if you know the person's name and if you know where they were married or born. And that is always a difficulty. Not all of them were followed, and so there was a penalty if you failed to register a birth.
Okay.
So you might find a baptismal record and a birth record that are as much as 4 or 5 months different, meaning the person is born 5 months after they were baptized, because the Irish would ensure they got baptized. When they got to town, they would report they were born, but they would report they were born within the time frame necessary to avoid the penalty.
The penalty.
You know, well, that was a good incentive because, you know, I find here there was the requirement for registering births, but they didn't always do it because there was no penalty.
No penalty.
And so that's a good, but that's a good point to realize that, you know, there was that penalty. So that's the reason why
so you can't dismiss a record that you find that, well, this couldn't be my ancestor because they were baptized earlier, so it must be somebody else. No, if you keep in mind that registration was to the Irish was something else being imposed by the English, and they were, in many cases, opposed to anything the English wanted them to do.
Prior to that, if you were Presbyterian, is it possible that you might also find that registration in a Church of England or Church of Ireland registry because the Presbyterians weren't really recognized officially, and this was a way to make sure that?
Occasionally, the Presbyterians would have their records in the Church of Ireland. But for the most part, I would say 99% of the time that the Presbyterians did not want to be associated with the Church of Ireland. They were very distinct from them. Sometimes there are Catholic records in the Church of Ireland because even though they couldn't get married legally by a Catholic priest, they wanted to be recognized as being married, and the only way to be recognized as being married was to have it recorded in the Church of Ireland's records.
Right, that's what I was
but
thinking.
Presbyterians seldom did it.
They didn't?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and one of the things too that I know with Scotland, there were naming patterns that also fall into or create problems where the oldest son was named after the father's father, and if there was a second son, the mother's father, and vice versa for daughters. So, you know, that can also help sometimes and also sometimes be problematic.
Same thing in Ireland, and it's one of those rules that we don't want to say is hard and fast. It will lead you astray, as all rules do. None of them are hard and fast. But normally, the eldest male was named after the father's father, and the eldest daughter was named after the mother's mother, and then the second child was after the father, et cetera, et cetera. And if there was a child that was born and then died, like a male that had been named after the father's father, the next male very often was named the same. So you might find records with somebody that you think should be born in such and such a year, but there's a record for them being born earlier. It could be that there was a child.
Yeah, I had that happen with my great-grandfather's brother from Scotland. I had found his brother's birth record, and then I'm looking through birth records, and about 2 years before, there's another birth record with the same set of parents, but different birth date and all. So that caused me then to go looking for a death certificate, which fortunately I found. And so, you know, it solved the mystery, but at the time I didn't know that that was the case where they would.
Your mention of Scotland is important. The Scottish records are better than Irish records, and I say that as an Irish researcher. The Scottish were keeping records before, and they're more detailed. Not only are they better, but they're more detailed. But we have to remember that many of the Irish left, and they didn't come to the United States. They went to Scotland or they went to England. So there are a lot of Irish records, particularly in the 1850 time frame when they left after the famine, in Scotland.
Well, and that's another thing. We have people who came here who are supposedly Scotch-Irish and, you know, Scottish or Irish. What's the distinction there?
If we could put that slide up of the map of Ireland again, just for a second, please. The one that shows the 4 provinces. That one there. Go. You'll notice that top portion is called Ulster, and that's one of the provinces of Ireland. The English government wanted to populate that part of the country, and they went to Scotland and recruited Scottish families and whole villages to move to Ulster, called the Ulster Plantation, with the promise of free land.
Okay.
Free to the Scotch is just about the right price. So they moved en masse to that portion of the country, Ulster. Unfortunately, as they soon found out, it put them under the thumb of England again. Right. And that's not what they wanted. So they didn't rebel in the sense of physically fighting, but they were opposed to the English. And so they began migrating themselves. And they were the first migration out of Scotland, of Ireland, sort of en masse. They left and came. And to distinguish themselves from Irish, they were known as Scotch-Irish because that's where they came from.
Well, it's interesting that I'm learning something today because, you know, learning that they were giving away free land, because I had always heard that the Scottish opened the prison doors and shipped the bad guys, the prisoners, to Ireland to cause this migration.
No, these were capable people. Tradesmen, farmers, and people who were going to maintain the land, populate it, make it productive so it could be taxed. And be productive, yes.
And I think the government was trying to displace a lot of the Irish that were there.
Yes,
so this
correct.
was their way to do that.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, this points to the idea that it's really hard to tell if your ancestor is Irish or Scottish. And my friend who has a history, her long line of Scots, got her DNA back, and it didn't exactly confirm that. There was an awful lot of Irish, and of course that was a fair amount of consternation for her. So I think what you're talking about is the reason that it's somewhat confusing to people.
It is. You remember, geographically, these two countries are right next to each other. It's just a short distance across the Irish Sea from one to the other. So in later years, in the 1800s, they frequently went back and forth to work. They would work in the summer harvesting crops in one country, and they'd go back and live in the other one, vice versa, from Scotland to Ireland, Ireland to Scotland. More frequently from Ireland to Scotland, and likewise Ireland to England. They moved over there, they worked over there, and then they came back to their home in Ireland. So they were very familiar with each other's country.
Now, one of the things that we often hear is that it's difficult to really do Irish research once you make that link back to Scotland.
Ireland.
Or Ireland, rather, yeah.
I would say that is true. It is true. And I used to say it's more so for the Irish, but it's not. It's every ethnic group has difficulties.
Yes.
But it's because in 1922, many of the official government records were blown up during the rebellion. And included in those records that were blown up were the census records, those that existed at the time. And the census records in Ireland were extensive. Before we were maintaining head of every name indexes here in the United States in our census, they were doing that. They started in 1831.
Wow.
Okay.
And in the 1851 census for Ireland, they asked the question, who was living in this household in 1841, who's not living here now, and where are they? Well, that was the years after the famine. So you've got answers like dead, you've got answers gone to America, but those censuses were blown up. How do we know that they had those kinds of questions? Well, statistically, they kept the statistics.
Yeah, that was in Dublin.
Yes, right, it was in Dublin. And you, in doing the research, they can find remnants of some of these censuses that when they got blown up through the roof, people found pieces of them and actually returned them.
And it's my understanding that they are trying to recreate as many documents as they can. They've put a word out to the population and to families all over to please share information so
information
they can
that's in their attics, that's in their
Yeah.
barns, whatever you've got, that we can reconstitute some information about what was going on at that time. But that's why it makes it so difficult. It doesn't mean that all the records are gone. It just means
It's much like
it's
the
much harder.
1890 census. Here, it's not completely 100% gone, but for example, there's one county that survived, or at least a portion of it survived, for New Jersey out of the 1890 census.
Lucky.
No, because it's not one of my counties that I need.
invariably it'll be the same way in Ireland.
But it's the same kind of thing. And I don't remember, I heard the story, but have they moved those records from one place to another? I know there was something that I heard in a lecture years ago that if they had only done something, they probably would not have gotten blown up.
Well,
that
if they had
was
not
political.
used that record office as the storage for their arms, it wouldn't have got blown up either.
Was what
And that was where they were keeping all the munitions, was in that, quote, safe room. And that's where the artillery landed right into that safe room. And when it blew up, all the ammunition blew up, and that was all gone up in smoke.
One thing I've been told is that the Presbyterian Church, there was a requirement that the Church of Ireland needed to give all their records to this repository because they wanted to keep it in one place. But the Presbyterians were reluctant to do that. So if you have a Presbyterian ancestor, there's a possibility that those records are still available.
Very much, and that's why the Catholic records are still available. Both of those were not part of the Church of Ireland, so they didn't forward, not considered part of the government, so they were not forwarded to the government's record-keeping office. And some of the Church of Ireland records didn't comply either.
I'm sure.
So they still have some of those, particularly up north.
So, and you kind of touched on one other thing with people immigrating to the United States. There was a famine, and what was the significance of that?
If we can get that slide, I'd show some statistics there if we could. But the significance of it was the population in Ireland halved between 1841 and 1851. There were that many people that either left or died due to the famine. And the population, those people, many of them came here to the United States. Between 1821 and 1900, a little over 3.8 million people left Ireland and came to the United States. 3.8 million people came. Wow. Prior to that, as you can see, there was about 100,000 people that came. Most of those were Scots-Irish that came in that early migration pattern.
Right.
And the states that they came into, New York, Massachusetts, East Coast states for the most part, but surprisingly, California. And why? The gold rush.
Okay.
People went out to the gold rush for that. Yeah. And I tell people, many of the Irish who were leaving were desperate to get out. So while their ancestors may have come to New England, the ship going out was headed to New Orleans, and they got on it. They just got on it to leave. So you'll find them arriving in New Orleans, and there are ship's records, of course, of passenger lists of arrivals in New Orleans. And what did they do? They went up to Mississippi and settled in the St. Louis area. Okay. So you may have part of your family in New England and part of your family in St. Louis, and you say, how did they get there?
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time, Paul. This is very interesting, very helpful. We appreciate your coming, and we're going to have Paul back as a guest, and Janelle wanted to speak about MVGS.
Yes, I just wanted to invite everyone to the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. We have our meetings the third Tuesday of each month. We're at the Holland Hall Center at 1500 Shenandoah Road. Come see our website. It's posted up there, and we hope we'll see you at some of the meetings. Thank you, and thanks, Paul.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. Thank you for inviting me. It was very enjoyable. Yeah.
Glad to have you.